I love Dune. The books were the first big sci-fi epic series I ever got into. I remember going to the public library, imagine those, and seeing an old book with a giant worm on the cover, and I was so enthralled by that image that I just had to read it. Over the coming years, Dune would eventually fade into the background of my media consumption, but then I discovered something amazing, a video game, Dune 2, Battle for Arrakis, and for the second time I had fallen in love with the world of Dune. Dune 2 was absolutely not like the books at all. Despite what the game says, the Atreides colors are green and black, not blue like in the game, and House Ordo doesn't factor into the actual struggle for Arrakis at all. In fact, I think House Ordo was taken from a very brief footnote and expanded to give a third faction for the game. In a lot of ways, the use of Arrakis for an RTS game was extremely prescient. Like its parent property, which was a huge influence on Star Wars, Dune 2 would eventually plant the seeds that would grow into an RTS tree and give us great fruit, like Command & Conquer. Unfortunately, the tree is rather sadly quite withered nowadays. However, Dune has always famously had troubles with adaptation to the screen. I think Dune 2, the video game, gets away with its numerous changes because the player is meant to use the backstory of Dune as a pretext to contextualize them blowing up all the little pixelated men on screen. Famously, of course, Dune has had two big adaptations for the screen, those done by David Lynch and Alejandro Jodorowsky. And they are both famous or maybe infamous for not really being successful. In the case of Lynch, his movie was kind of a box office bomb, and in the case of Jodorowsky, well, that was never made. So despite what some crypto bros are telling you, I don't really think we'll ever see what that version of Dune would have been. As you can imagine, therefore, when I looked at 2021's adaptation of Dune by Denis Villeneuve, I was very trepidatious. However, when I saw the film, all doubts were evaporated in my mind, and it was probably the best film that I had seen in a number of years. In a lot of ways, Villeneuve had adapted the essence of Dune in a way that made it seem both incredibly expansive and unknowable, but also extremely accessible, even to casual outsiders. I saw Dune with a person who had never engaged with any of the Dune material before watching the film, and from their reaction, it kindled the same interest in the franchise that the books had done for me all those years ago. So believe me when I say this, that I'm really into Dune. But I have some problems with the way that the series handles its weapons. Here's why. Before I get into it, I do want to provide a disclaimer. I will be focusing on the 2021 Dune movie. I think the movie encapsulates the problem that I'm going to be talking about rather nicely, but I also recognize that the movie's show-don't-tell approach leaves some gaps in the wider Dune narrative. So where I feel it's necessary, I will rely on some of the literature to bridge those gaps. So be aware, there are spoilers ahead. Okay, so with that out of the way, in order to discuss the problems with the weapons in Dune, I think it's a good idea to see what the weapons are actually like.
Don't stand with your back to the door. How many times do we have to tell you? 80 years Arrakis belonged to House Harkonnen. 80 years of owning the spice fields. Can you imagine the wealth?
Will it be that bad?
You don't get it, do you? You don't really understand the grave nature of what's happening to us. Your eyes, I need to see it in your eyes. You never met Harkonnens before. I have. They're not human, they're brutal. Choose your blade.
Gotta play the date, Ernie. Give us a song instead. Oh, man.
Fight!
This scene between Paul and Gurney, where the latter tests the former in combat, I think is quite instructive. In a lot of ways, this scene is really great. It shows a number of interesting things about the characters of Paul and Gurney. Gurney is a strict disciplinarian. He does not want to underestimate the Harkonnens, and he doesn't want Paul to underestimate them too. And Paul, for his credit, despite seeming rather frail, he certainly doesn't look like a stereotypical action hero, he's actually a good fighter. So there's a lot of great foreshadowing in this scene that we'll pick up on later. More importantly, however, this scene represents the vast majority of the fights that we will see in the rest of the movie. That is, in the future, when someone on screen dies, the odds are that they will die in a fight similar structure and logic to the one that we see here. In a lot of ways, this scene plays to the film's show don't tell style really well. I know the temptation to stop the scene and explain shield technology would have been enormous, but rather than that, which would slow down the pace, and frankly be very clunky, we get a nice visual and implicit explanation for how shields work and how they relate to combat. In general, we see that combat is largely dictated by the use of melee weapons, very specifically swords, and shields. We see that Paul demonstrates the principles of shielded fighting, namely, that relatively quick strikes will be blocked by the shield, but a slower moving strike can actually pass through, and that if you want to kill someone with a shield on, you have to actually stab them in such a way that you will go through the shield and hurt them inside of it. Shields are ubiquitous in this world, and the implications of their use is incredibly plot relevant at several points. Although the movie never stops to explain any of this, the use and prevalence of shields is one of the reasons why, in the grim darkness of the far future, personal combat with blades is still so very common. Context, in the books, shields are extremely effective against pretty much all projectile weapons, except for a few low-velocity examples. More advanced weapons like lasers aren't used because if a laser hits a shield, it causes a nuclear explosion, killing everyone in a nearby vicinity. So obviously for that reason, that has to be avoided. Because shields are so effective against most other weapons, and the consequences of using laser weapons against shields are so dire, combat is largely dictated by melee combat because that's the safest way of engaging with people and maximizing the threat to harm ratio. This is somewhat defied by the Harkonnens, who in the book do bring artillery with them to Arrakis to fight the Atreides, but them doing so is noted to be highly unusual in the lore of the world. The movie, on the other hand, does allow for larger ordnance weapons, but for the most part, the combats that we see are fought with infantry, fighting at close range, usually with swords. This is definitely a far cry from the RTS game, where large tank battles are totally the norm, but I digress. There are a number of fundamental characteristics that are broadly applicable to the way in which combats in Dune are conducted. Firstly, most battles will happen at close range because shield technology means that ranged weapons are relegated to extremely niche uses. We see this several times, such as during the assault of the Harkonnens on the Atreides position. The shields of the city prevent them from attacking it indirectly. They need to use espionage to actually bring the shields down, and that forces them to land troops to fight the Atreides in hand-to-hand combat. Gurney telling Paul that you fight whenever the necessity arises, no matter the mood, definitely rings true here as he leads the household soldiers armed with just blades in their casual attire against the incoming Harkonnen troops. Secondly, individual soldiers are very important to combat. One of the consequences of the shield technology is that because it forces soldiers to fight up close and personal, it also necessitates a great deal of personal combat skill. For the most part, fights consist of groups of soldiers fighting each other in one-on-one encounters in a very chaotic, disorganized fashion. The one exception that we see to this is when some Atreides soldiers form some kind of formation, phalanx, with spears and swords. Really the only time this happens in the movie, and they're able to hold off a large Harkonnen attack rather successfully until of course they are flanked from behind by the Imperial Sardaukar. The rest of the time, however, it's all chaotic melees. The implication of this scene is very interesting because it implies that even without their armor, the Atreides formation and drill is far superior to the Harkonnen disorganized mob attack. And that makes me wonder why we don't see more evidence for formation fighting in the rest of the film. Dune, at its heart, is a depiction of a feudal world order projected way into the future. If you're wondering where Star Wars got a lot of its inspiration from, or where Warhammer 40k stole a bunch of its ideas, well, Dune is the source of that. It is a combination of science fiction and medievalism that produces this unique world that we can't help but find compelling. I certainly do. In our own world, despite what movies and video games would have you believe, ancient and medieval battles were fought by masses of soldiers in formation. It's a sign of things going really badly if the fighting has degenerated to single combats in chaotic melee, because it means that order has broken down and the coherency of the army is fracturing. Despite holding true to so many of the tenets of feudalism, aristocracies, guilds, swords, knights, nobles, etc., the combat that we see in Dune is largely not representative of the type of combat that you would expect to see from a medieval period or even earlier. Rather, in fact, kind of the opposite. Finally, the armaments of Dune are unusual. Let's take a look at the swords, shall we? For the most part, soldiers fight with small one-handed swords with little in the way of hand protection and these broad blades that are meant for cutting. Certainly, it's very utilitarian and functional looking. Not the first thing that I would associate with Dune, if I'm honest. And I have to admit, the effect of the swords is that they look a lot like Uruk-hai swords from Lord of the Rings. In truth, relatively small swords of this type are more likely to be associated with the use of large protective shields like the Roman gladius and scutum combination. Yet, here they are the primary weapons of all infantry formations. In fact, for a setting that is so in tune with elements of the past, the swords of Dune are very divorced from any recognizable mainline historical sword lineages. They're angular and utilitarian weapons, and maybe to some extent that actually fits the tone of the film. But I also think it clashes with the idea that Dune is about these continuous echoes of humanity's distant past that have been distorted by time, taking the familiar into the unusual. Like, for example, the bagpipes, which get used to play the Atreides anthem. Something that I have not yet talked about is, of course, the prevalence of armor amongst the House troops. Atreides, Sardaukar, and Harkonnen troops all wear something which we could consider to be armor, with varying degrees of protectiveness. Although by the time most of the fighting breaks out, the Atreides soldiers are definitely without it. Given the prevalence of armor and its design, a logical assumption here is that the armor is meant to be used to stop sword blows that otherwise get through a shield, and that makes perfect sense. If you have a shield that protects you, but it can still be penetrated at close range, then wearing armor would keep you more protected because a sword is unlikely to cut through that armor. However, in the story and in the film, the armor is more or less useless. It serves a decorative role, as unfortunately fighters tend to bypass what would be a major obstacle to primarily sword-based combat, with alarming regularity. The type of sword that gets used in Dune, in our world, is the kind that would be associated with the use of a large shield. After all, something needs to make up for the deficiencies of the small sword in terms of protection. However, the shields in Dune don't function like real-world shields, for two reasons. Firstly, they protect your entire body as just opposed to what they can cover with their physical representation. And also, importantly, they allow you the use of your other hand. The historical use of shields comes with a major disadvantage in the sense that you have to give up the use of one of your hands in order to use it. And for a long time, that limited the weapons that were commonly found on battlefields. Funnily enough, the shields in Dune function a lot more like plate armor, because they allow you to use your other hand. It's well protected, it's no less protected than your primary hand, that's for sure, and it still protects your entire body. And while it gives you this great protection, it does leave you vulnerable to very specific attacks at close distance. Now, you might argue that Dune is not meant to represent the Middle Ages exactly, but rather mirror some elements of it as projected into the future. You would not need to have combat or weapons that reflect that time period. Certainly, that argument has merit, and I definitely agree with some of it. I don't think that the way that the combat is portrayed detracts from the experience of Dune in the slightest. After all, Dune 2, the game, is about huge armies of tanks and infantry fighting over Arrakis, and that's not accurate at all, what we understand of the setting, really, but it's nevertheless evocative of Dune and a fun game in its own right. While I think the argument has merit, I don't necessarily buy it. There is a relationship between arms and armor, and it's certainly true that we don't know the whole history of shield use and its effect on melee combat, but that if we accept that Dune does mirror the logic of the real world, and by all accounts it certainly does in many ways, then the swords that are represented in the media are incongruous to the context of the presentation. In addition to the fact that the soldiers from Dune are, by our standards and theirs, very well protected from harm through a combination of shields and armor, they also have, on top of that, a strong warrior culture that is tied to glory and honor. For example, the Sardaukar and Atreides soldiers. A great example of this is just Duncan Idaho, who fights a heroic last stand to save the life of his liege and dies in the manner in which we would think of a heroic knight. To grapple with this, I think looking at human history is instructive. In our own history, when personal protection for soldiers improved significantly, we always see the adoption of larger and more sophisticated weapons. For example, when plate armor emerged in the 14th and 15th centuries, warriors, especially knights, started to carry large two-handed weapons. Look at a knight in the 13th century, and then look at a knight in the 14th century. Plate armor had evolved to such a point that carrying a shield was unnecessary, and that the armor of opponents required stronger weapons to deal with. This is not only evident in Europe either. Around the world, whenever warriors became well protected enough, they tended to favor large two-handed weapons and to, generally speaking, give up using shields. In Dune, a soldier with a personal shield and armor is very well protected, if we were to follow historical trends, then large, generally two-handed weapons would be the norm for the rank and file. Nobles and elites like Paul and Gurney certainly could and probably should practice with swords as they do, but it would be a sign of skill with those weapons in particular. The rank and file, who aren't dedicating as much of their time to training, certainly could be using things like two-handed weapons to be more in line with the fact that they are well protected and well armored, and generally speaking, going to have to deal with other people in the same situation. Of course, if everyone in the world abides by the same general rules for fighting, that is, if everyone has shields and swords of more or less the same size, then there isn't really an issue per se, because there is equality between forces, but it's still unusual that it occurred like this, because, of course, you can't have every element of the technology come into play at the same time. The first shields were not as effective as the shields that we have now. The first swords would have not been as effective as the weapons that exist now. There has to have been some evolution of these things, usually one after the other in sort of an arms race type way, rather than simply just everything appearing whole cloth. Also, there is another possibility. As mentioned, the soldiers in Dune are generally well protected, but as the movie shows us, armor is not always a given, or actually even all that useful. In fact, it seems to generally take a ceremonial role more than a battlefield one. Instead of fixating on the medieval period, perhaps maybe we should project our minds a little bit more forward. So, enter the European Renaissance. In a lot of ways, it fits the brief that we've outlined. We have, in Renaissance society, in places especially like Italy and France, obsessions with nobility, intrigues, amassing political power, and elites. In this period, we have huge, big noble houses that are starting to emerge and vie for control with each other. You have situations where emperors are contrasted against their nobles, who are contrasted against, guilds and so on and so forth. And you have situations where these big noble houses vie with each other for control of political and social resources. While battles in the Renaissance were generally mediated increasingly by pikes and muskets, civilian society was often more rife with street brawls and duels. In particular, these were conducted usually without much in the way of armor and generally centered around the skill of the combatants fighting. In this way, I think a case could be made for Dune to borrow from these weapons of this time period to deliver on its more broader thematic elements. The iconic weapon of the Renaissance is, of course, the rapier. For dealing with shields, assuming armor is not that important, a long weapon to keep someone at a distance would be pretty good, because of course, if your shield can only be penetrated by a slow enough blow, and generally those kinds of blows are better delivered at close quarters, keeping someone away from you could be a useful technique to have on a battlefield. And the issue is, of course, that you have to make sure that if you're going to deliver a thrust, you want to deliver it slow enough to get through the shield without bouncing off. Here I think it's a great opportunity to show a more unique form of martial art develop, specifically to do something generally allowing for half thrusts, or kind of a staggered thrust, where you deliver a slow initial thrust that is slow enough to get through the shield, but then rapidly accelerate to puncture the target underneath. And that I think would be a great example of echoing a past technique, but distorting it with the technology of Dune to show how time and technology have changed, something that, was prevalent on old Earth. Of course, that still means that you can have more cut-centric swords. Not every sword in the Renaissance was a rapier, after all. But I do think that adding this diversity of sword types would better suit the diverse nature of humanity in the setting, and also, of course, the diverse nature of combat. In real life, there was not a single type of sword, and all of humanity didn't settle on a single type of sword. Enter, of course, the freemen. They are, by and large, an exception to most of the things that I've been talking about, because they are an isolated culture that has lived on a planet bereft of, generally speaking, access to technology, high technology. They don't generally have access to energy shields, nor do they have widespread access to ranged weapons. Rather, they are masters of ambush and guerrilla tactics. It makes perfect sense, of course, they having lived and fought in the desert for who knows how long. It definitely makes sense that they would develop a style of combat that uses small swords and daggers in deadly close quarters fighting. And that would be how their fighting has evolved on Arrakis. It doesn't really matter how skilled you are as a fighter if your opponent can just ambush you by jumping up from behind you and stabbing you in the neck. Larger weapons in this context would be way more cumbersome to carry in the desert, and the Freeman way of fighting, with its focus on ambush and close quarters knife fighting, would probably be able to outclass the more static method of fighting associated with the house troops, like the Arconans or the Atreides. So here we have a great contrast and subsequent demonstration of the insufficiencies of the House Imperial style of combat. And that would be well demonstrated on Arrakis by showing how poor it tends to fare against the Fremen way of war. As it stands, I think the way that the movie presents them is that all the groups tend to fight in the same way, with mostly the same weapons, except that the Fremen tend to be generally better at it and incorporate ambushes into their style of warfare. To finish up, I generally agree with the show don't tell style of filmmaking used in Dune 2021. In contrast to the exposition-heavy David Lynch Dune, I think this movie flows a lot better as an overall property. But there are areas where I feel like the movie has been let down, either because more explanation could be needed, or because more elements could be a little bit more fleshed out, a little bit more dynamic. And that area in particular is the way that fighting is conducted. Obviously, there are tenets to Dune that have to remain as they are. The use of shields, the focus on melee combat, generally speaking, a lack of technology when it comes to fighting. But I do think that generally the way that they went with the weapons is a disservice to the franchise, because there is potential in terms of the filmmaking to show more varied styles of fighting